these structures are what create a gap between the system state and what we think we know. And this is what I mean about seeing the present more quickly. These system structures, the combined effect, all of those 7 ones I just went over, the combined effect is that it often creates a gap between the state of the system. The state of the system is if you had a computer game, right, and you could look at any point in time at the actual program of that computer game, it would tell you exactly where every figure was, every piece on the game was. It would tell you the value of their health or their strength or all these, any video game you play. The state of the system is what the computer knows, but the player only knows the information they're getting. And so the system state is often kind of a perfect information, but it's rarely accessible to us, and we don't often have access to it. And the gap is created by these structures. And so I want to use the example of a limits to growth pattern and walk through this to show kind of how these develop. And I'm going to see if I can get up. I got to imagine, may edit this part out here, but here we go. All right, seems like it's on, but if you have questions, post them up. So this is a feedback loop of births and population. It's a growth feedback loop. We call that positive reinforcing. It's got that plus sign. And again, don't worry too much about the symbols, but let's walk through what it does. It's a simple population growth. You have births, that increases population. As you have more population, you have more births, right? This is a feedback loop of a system structure, and it creates a behavior that looks like this: virtuous and vicious. Virtuous is when the feedback loop, if we have more births, we have more population, we have more population, we have more births. It creates exponential growth, and you can see this here. The red is the vicious behavior, which is for some reason, if we have less births, we have less people, less births. Again, positive and reinforcing loops are not always up or always down. It's exponential behavior. It's exponential growth or exponential or / geometric decline. And it shows these two kinds of behaviors. This loop on its own can only make these two kinds of behaviors. So this is the visible system structure, right? This is what we see because we can see people and we can see them having kids, and that grows the population. But the more population you have, the more deaths you're going to have. Right? People get older, they die, and the more deaths you have, the less population you have. This is a balancing or goal-seeking loop, a negative goal-seeking. And what it means is it's seeking a goal, it's seeking an equilibrium here. And where those equilibriums or that balancing point is located is often based on this latent constraint. So this is where latent systems come in. And I'm just picking one here. This is very simplified, but we talk about food scarcity, right? If we have a lot of people, we're going to increase the food scarcity. As the food scarcity increases, we have more deaths. As we have more deaths, we have less people. And the behavior of a negative balancing feedback loop is what's called exponential approach. And that just means it's approaching this natural balance point, which is where the population meets the available food. And again, this is very simplified. Often there's many different constraints at play, but this is just a really simple aggregate thing that if you think about, if we grow the population beyond our food means, we're going to lose population until we find ourselves in some sort of balance. And again, the food scarcity is not visible. You can't see food scarcity as it's developing. You can see it later when people are dying off from famine, but you can't see it as it's developing. So when you combine these two, you begin to get what these threshold and tipping point effects are. So the loops at the bottom shows a cumulative population growth, and it's color-coded. Green here is where the reinforcing loop is dominant, this one on the left. And the yellow is when the balancing loop, the one on the right here, is dominant. And loop dominance is saying which one of these loops is in charge, which one is determining the system. And you can see on the right here, this is a rate of change. So this is the number of people born per year, perhaps, or dying, born per year, or total number of people per year. And so on the left, total population, on the right, rate of change. If this begins to look a lot like COVID-19 graphs, there's a reason for it. And we'll get to COVID later, but these are the fundamental system structures that are behind population growth, pandemics, business growth. All of these things are often driven by these very simple patterns with similar. But what happens is as the population gets up to a certain point, it hits that food scarcity latent constraint, and the growth rate begins to And you can see here, your rate of change is very high as your total population increases. But as you hit that limits, the limits are activated. That's what this yellow means. The growth slows down. You begin losing people. It's harder to feed. And you begin reaching that balancing point until you have this balancing effect. And this balancing effect means that you've reached a population at a certain level and it's stopped there. Now, on a rate of change, the rate of change drops dramatically because this is the actual, you go from having 20 people, new people a year in a simple population to having 1 or 2, so it's the rate of change drops off. And you'll see these in COVID predictions when you see the daily rate on one of these, rise and collapse. A wave is a sharp increase in the rate of change followed by a sharp decline and has what's called an S-shaped pattern here on the left. These are all driven by this latent constraint. If you could see into the system at this point in time, you would see we're running out of food and you would know what's going to happen. You're not predicting the future. You're just seeing what the system state is telling you. The system state knows this, but we as the participants don't always know it. Good. So I've got some questions on there. So this is the generic system pattern, and I'm going to show it in business, and then I'm going to run to questions because I saw there was a question. But this, remember, these system patterns are ubiquitous. This is called the limits to growth system pattern, and we can show it again in business. In business, right, we have the two. We have the positive or reinforcing feedback loop. We have the negative or balancing loop. We have sales. The more sales you have, the more successful project. The more successful projects, the more sales. It's growth. It's great. It's virtuous. Things go up. But the more successful projects you have, the more delays you have. Mike, this may sound familiar with contracting. The more delays you have, the less successful projects you have. And the constraint here, the latent constraint's not food scarcity, it's the throughput constraints. The throughput constraint is how many simultaneous projects can I work on and maintain my schedule? If you're doing dispatch, how many drivers do I need on the road to maintain a delivery time? If you're talking IT applications, how many applications of different sizes can I simultaneously be working on? Because this one is driving growth. It wants to expand the growth up, but it hits this latent constraint, which keeps it, again, a constraint's like a ceiling. It's a ceiling on the growth that we'll put in place. And you can see this effect here. Again, it's the same pattern. It's an S-shaped growth on the left with a rise and collapse on the right in rate of change. But you can see same thing happen. We're growing our sales. We're getting more projects. The balancing loop becomes dominant. It's activated at a certain point in time, and that's that tipping point. This is why we call it a tipping point. You can see the tipping point right here in this yellow where the system goes, it was growing straight up, it tips, and it starts going straight down in a rate of change. We call this the threshold effect. What happens on the other side of the tipping point is the threshold effect. Think of it like a balance, like a teeter-totter, right? You can be on one end of the teeter-totter, and you can be fairly balanced and going, but as you start walking forward and get closer to that fulcrum, that center point, that's the tipping point. You take one step on the other side of that, and all of a sudden you're going down. You've switched from going up to going down, and it's a pretty dramatic change. It's no more complicated than that. We're just dealing with system structures we can't see. So let me pause here and go through some of the questions that I'm seeing. Mike is asking, using the skilled trades as an example, I have noticed a trend that they are pushing skilled trades more instead of college over the last years. Seeing how there is a reduction in skilled trade, the wages for skilled laborers have increased. Is this similar to the positive negative loop? Yes, this is you can think of these as supply and demand too. And the simple economics is a supply demand intercept. And the more sophisticated way is to think of it as feedback, right? As you have more people going into college and getting college degrees, the supply is increasing. The latent constraint is the availability of paid work for those degrees. And in a lot of degrees, the paid work, the supply is outstripping the demand. And so you have this limit to growth in the salary range because they have plenty of people to pick from. And there's, again, these are all simplified. You could talk about H-1B visas and skilled immigrants bringing works and the influence of that, but we're keeping it simple. At the same time, Mike, to your point, there's trade skills, vocational skills, things like that. They're underneath their constraint. And they have what you might call a capacity support, a latent support, which is the need of these things to keep the lights on. I need buildings built. I need plumbing done. I need electricians electrifying things. You know, I need stuff to happen, and I need trade skills to do that. So there's a latent support, and if there's not enough supply, it's going to drive that system to balance and find, well, what do you balance on? You balance on increasing the wage to attract people into that trade, and, you know, trying to get them to stay in that, perhaps with the unions or the benefits or things like that. These are very simple descriptions of economic effects, but yes, that's a good example. Right, and Mike's saying he hates delays. Some people like delays because in the contract, if it requires the contractor to pay extra wages, overtime to meet the deadline. Yeah, delays can be very nasty because they can catch up on you. And a lot of project management is often about managing these delays and managing them effectively, but very little about project management. PMP is dealing with latent systems effect. It's all of project management as a discipline, even Agile, almost entirely deals with visible system effects. They're not looking at the latent systems. That's why you need something like system structure, structured systems thinking, to go in and create these maps to understand what's going on. Tony chimes in, logistics is all about managing those constraints. Absolutely, it's a balancing act to go through all these different structures. Good questions. Appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.